In Chapter 7, we will be going over understanding the potential dangers of adverse environmental conditions. The first kind of environmental illness or concern that we would have would be hyperthermia or heat illness. This is probably one of the most common environmental situations that we deal with in San Diego County, at least. And I've tried to list the heat illnesses in order of how serious they are on these slides. So basically, when it comes to heat illness, one concept that's important to understand is that the body cools itself primarily through sweat evaporation. So we sweat, that breeze or cool air helps that sweat to evaporate and it cools our body. If it's really damp outside, if the humidity index is high, that evaporation doesn't occur as well, and also doesn't occur as well in the heat. However, heat illness can happen even in cooler temperatures if we're not drinking enough fluids. So if we don't have fluids to make the sweat to evaporate, then we can still get heat illness in cooler temperatures as well. Some of the worst heat illnesses have actually occurred even at 55-degree temperatures due to hydration status. Our first heat illness that we're going to discuss is heat syncope or fainting. Basically, what causes this is standing or exercising in the heat for a long time. The blood vessels in the blood vessels in general open up, they dilate, and blood will pool in the legs. And this will cause dizziness and fainting because there's not enough blood to go to the brain. So thankfully, fainting is relatively self-corrective. Once the person is fainted, the blood is going back to the head, and so the individual will feel slightly better. So for heat syncope, basically the treatment is to just lay the person down in a cool place and increase their fluid intake. For those of you who have been in the military, I'm sure you've seen this, especially when somebody's standing at attention for a long time in heat, this can happen because the person's just not moving around enough to return the blood flow to the head, and the blood will pool in the legs and the person will just pass out. Next on our list is exertional heat cramps. So still not too big of a deal. They're uncomfortable, but generally speaking, if a person has exertional heat cramps, they will still be able to return to play. This is what happens when somebody gets muscle spasms from water loss or an electrolyte imbalance. And this can occur in any athlete who overexerts themselves, although we do tend to see certain people who we consider crampers that tend to get cramps often when they're exercising. Our treatments for this are to drink water and or Gatorade, preferably ahead of time. If I have somebody who's a known cramper, I definitely try to get them to load up with water and Gatorade for at least one day ahead of time, usually two, to make sure that they're coming in hydrated. We want to do light stretching and possibly ice or ice massage for this person to relieve their discomfort. And those things should all help to relax the muscle spasm. Our next heat illness that we're going to discuss is called exertional heat exhaustion. So this is more of a middle ground heat illness. So we're a little bit more concerned about this. We definitely want to make sure this person is getting treated appropriately and that we are not missing this diagnosis. So with exertional heat exhaustion, this is usually caused by prolonged sweating. If the person has been sick and had diarrhea, then that's going to mess with their fluid balance in general in their body. So they may be coming into the exercise dehydrated already, and or inadequate fluid replacement. So basically anything that's making the person lose a lot of fluids. Signs for this are profuse sweating, pale skin, slightly increased body temperature, dizziness, heat cramps, hyperventilation, and or rapid heart rate. So usually when somebody has heat exhaustion, they tend to be what we call diaphoretic, so very sweaty, and kind of pale or maybe even bluish looking, possibly. They look sick. They don't look good. When somebody has heat exhaustion versus the next heat illness we're going to talk about, their core temperature will be about 102. I don't know if anybody in the class has kids, but those of you who do will know how to accurately take a core temperature. I don't usually take core temperatures on athletes because the only way to get an accurate core temperature is to take it rectally. So usually as athletic trainers, we go more by their signs. But if somebody was really sick and we wanted to know whether or not they had heat exhaustion versus heat stroke, we would really need to get an accurate core temperature. That is really what helps us to determine one versus the other. People will recover from heat exhaustion. People do not always recover from heat stroke, the next worst illness. So that's why it's important to know the difference. For heat exhaustion, performance may decrease. That kind of makes me laugh because performance probably will decrease because the individual is just not hydrated enough to stay healthy. Immediate treatment for heat exhaustion would be immediate fluid ingestion, sitting in a cool place. If the person is in bad enough condition, they may need IV fluids. When I was in college, we had football two-a-day camp up at Camp Roberts. I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and Camp Roberts was very hot. It was triple digits in the evening, and one of the guys actually, I think, got heat exhaustion and was cramping for about 2 or 3 hours. And he really should have gone to the hospital, but our head athletic trainer didn't want to take him. So instead, he probably drank about 6 to 8 pints of Gatorade and water over the course of 2 to 3 hours and finally started to feel better. So in his case, he would have definitely benefited from some IV fluids instead. So our most severe heat illness is called exertional heat stroke. This is a very serious life-threatening condition. Some signs of heat stroke would be sudden collapse, LOC or loss of consciousness, flushed hot skin, so the person will probably look red instead of pale as with heat exhaustion, and their skin may be dry. Although if somebody's been sweating for a long period prior to getting heat stroke, they may not actually be dry. So what happens with heat stroke, though, is the person stops sweating. So if you see somebody who's been working out for a very long time and they're not sweating, that's a really good indication of heat stroke. The person will have shallow breathing, a strong rapid heart rate, and a core temperature of equal to or above 104. So again, that would be a rectal temperature. We'd have to take that rectally, because if we were taking, an oral or a tympanic or ear temperature, just would not be accurate. Somebody with heat stroke may or may not get the other heat illnesses first. So a person with heat stroke can go straight into heat stroke. They don't need to get cramping or heat exhaustion first, but they could. For somebody with heat stroke, their temperature must be lowered very quickly. So usually what we'll do is we're going to take drastic measures to cool that athlete within 45 minutes of becoming ill. If we don't, that person will get multi-system organ failure and they could die. So what we do as athletic trainers, if we have this available to us in close proximity, is we will try to put them into a cold whirlpool. So there's a picture of that on the top of the slide there, one of our cold tubs. So we want to put the person in the cold whirlpool for a few minutes. We don't want their temperature to come all the way down, because if we bring them all the way down, their body will actually continue to cool after being in the cold water and they could get dangerously low. So we usually just try to decrease their body temperature by a few degrees, so out of the danger zone basically. So we'll try to bring them down maybe to like 102 or 100, and then let their body cool itself the rest of the way after we pull them out of the tub. With heat stroke, again, it's very common for somebody to have a loss of consciousness. So we always want to make sure, if we do put them in a cold tub or in cool water, that we're supporting their head above the water so they don't drown. But that is the most effective way to cool the person, is by putting them in an ice bath. If we can't do that though, we want to ice the groin, head, neck, and armpits. So anywhere that tends to feel hot when you get hot, or I kind of think of it as where I would want to place my hands if my hands were feeling cold. So any part of our body that stays hotter than the rest of the body, that's where we want to ice. And we want to do that as much as we can until we start to get their core temperature down. If we don't have any of those things available to us, just dumping water on them, getting as much clothing off as we can, and getting them into a cool place, just really getting them as cool as quickly as possible. It's important to actually do the cooling measures prior to calling EMS. We want to get them started getting colder before the ambulance gets there, because it's that important. It's so important to get them cooled down quickly. If we can do those things at the same time, great. But the person needs cooling immediately. When EMS comes, hopefully they would have some cooling blankets and things like that to try to control the body temperature. But if we do have a cold whirlpool available to us, it actually is the most effective way of cooling them, even more so than what the EMTs can do on the ambulance. But we still need to call EMS because the person is likely to have organ failure and will need follow-up treatment in the hospital. So we've talked about the different types of heat illness. Now let's talk about preventing heat illness. The biggest things that can help prevent heat illness are basically what I would consider common sense. So we want to consume fluids and stay cool, especially when exercising in hot temperatures. So if we have the ability to stand in the shade and it's hot out, we're going to try to do that. We want to consume a lot of fluids before exercise too. So if we know we're going to be working out on a very hot day, then we should try to hydrate at least the day beforehand and consume about 2 pints of water, Gatorade, or other hydrating fluids during the day before we do our exercise. Sometimes more. It depends on what part of the day we're exercising in. As far as fluid and electrolyte replacement, fluid intake is the most important factor to decrease the risk of heat illness. It's the main thing that we can control. I can't control how hot it is outside. I can't even necessarily control how hot it is in a gym. Sometimes air conditioning breaks. That happened in the fitness center at Miramar when I was working there once. So the fluid intake is really what we can control the most. So we want replacement of fluids to match our sweat loss. So one really easy way to measure this is to weigh ourselves before and after an activity. And if we weigh less after activity, then we want to replace fluids at a rate of 1 pint for every 1 pound of body weight lost. So it's basically one, normal size disposable water bottle. Another way that we can do this, if we're not able to measure or to weigh ourselves before and after, or if we just want to go by a general guideline during activity, is we want to drink about 1 pint of fluids for every 30 minutes of activity. And most people really do not get that much fluids. I usually have to remind athletes to drink enough constantly. Another way we can monitor this is by monitoring urine color after exercise. So if our urine looks more like lemonade, so that means we're hydrated. If it looks more like apple juice, that means we're dehydrated. So I don't know if any of you can see that the graphic that's at the top right-hand corner of the slide. Depending on what your monitor looks like, it might be a little difficult to say which one is which, but generally speaking, if somebody's in a 2, 3, 4 range, that's a pretty good range to be in. If they're getting it more on towards 5, 6, 7 on the numbers where the colors are, that's getting to be a little bit dehydrated. So the darker the urine becomes, the person is most likely less hydrated. Another thing that can help prevent heat illness, especially in equipment-intensive sports like football, say for instance, is to get used to exercising in the heat. So that's important for all sports, but especially when you're adding a lot of layers of equipment that don't allow the sweat evaporation, it's really important to have that gradual acclimatization. So it's best over a 10 to 14-day period. So for those of you who have played football or worked with football athletes, you'll notice that they tend to slowly add equipment. So once 2 days for football starts, they'll originally start off just wearing their helmets, say for instance, and then they'll slowly add in equipment. So a couple days later, they may add shoulder pads too, but they slowly work their way up to having all of their gear on, because most often 2 days for football is happening when it's very hot out, so usually around August. So it's really important for the student athletes to slowly acclimatize versus just putting all their gear on and then everybody gets heat illness all at once. Another type of illness that can occur when exercising is called hyponatremia. So hypo means less than or not enough, and natremia refers to salt in the blood. So basically with hyponatremia, there is an abnormally low concentration of sodium in the blood. And this is actually kind of the opposite of being dehydrated. This is being too hydrated. So this happens when somebody has too little salts or too much water in their blood. This can happen for a couple different reasons, but usually it's from ingesting too much fluid before, during, and or after an exercise. Athletes who drink a lot of water and sweat over several hours are at the greatest risk. So this is more common with marathoners, triathloners, or tournament play. I've seen it most often when I was working the San Diego Marathon in the first aid tents. My husband saw it in the emergency room once in a girl who had been playing in a soccer tournament, and she'd had, I think it was 2 or 3 games a day over the course of 3 days, and she'd been sick, so she'd been trying to hydrate as much as she possibly could because she'd had a cold or whatever, and she actually ended up giving herself hyponatremia. She's about 15. Her parents didn't actually really know how much she had been drinking until they started asking her about it, and they realized she had been overhydrating. But it's usually when people are exercising more over longer periods. Hyponatremia is totally preventable. The main thing is maintaining balance. So if somebody is doing a marathon or a triathlon that's longer, they shouldn't drink every station, especially during a marathon. So people will start off a marathon and they think they're doing such a good job. It's their first one and they're staying super hydrated, and then all of a sudden they'll start to get sick. And it's just because they were drinking too much. So, at the Rock and Roll Marathon, we used to actually hand out salt packets to people. So if they started to notice they weren't feeling well, or if they were starting to get their hands and feet were swollen, they would just down a salt packet, and it actually would correct it if we could catch it early. But usually what happens is that the person gets symptoms and they just start to not feel well. So they'll deteriorate somewhat slowly. It doesn't happen all at once usually, but all of a sudden the hands and feet will get very swollen. So individuals that I've asked to, or who I've heard talk about having hyponatremia, it's like they couldn't bring their fingers together because they were so swollen, or people can't take off their wedding rings, or they feel like they're super tight. Confusion for numbers especially. So the person will come up and they'll introduce themselves and you'll say, oh, okay, well, what's your address? And they're like, huh, that's really weird. I remember what street I live on, but I can't remember my house number. Or if you ask them what their phone number is, they'll be like, oh shoot, I can't remember. So they have a hard time with numbers for some reason. They'll have a headache, nausea, lethargy, and possibly agitation. The first person I ever saw with hyponatremia was of average condition. She was probably in her late 40s, early 50s, and for whatever reason, she thought it was a wonderful idea to run 2 marathons almost back to back, so within 2 weeks of each other. And she just wasn't doing well. She couldn't even answer a question. She was very confused. And it was a very weird situation. She had a very hard time answering any of our questions. So that could contribute as well if she just hadn't regained her hydration status and she hadn't returned to full health prior to trying to compete in a second marathon. So hypothermia, or being too cold, is not something that we experience very often in San Diego County, but it is possible. Usually hypothermia occurs at very cold temperatures, but generally speaking, it's usually not an issue because most activities create enough body heat to prevent hypothermia. And we can't prevent it by wearing lots of light layers. And then as we warm up during exercise, we can take off the layers that we need to stay at a good temperature. As far as exercising in cooler weather, it's important to increase warm-up time. And also remember that hydration is still important because we're still going to be sweating, and it's still important to keep the blood volume up to make sure that we don't get sick. Different things that can contribute to hypothermia would be low outside temperature in general, wind chill. I used to live in Michigan, and wind chill was definitely an issue, and or wetness. So if it's raining or if we're exercising in a snowy environment, those can all increase risk. So it's important to stay dry and to keep our light layers on. Another cold-related injury that people can get if they're exercising in very cold temperatures or if they get stuck outside in a very cold environment is frostbite. So we can get superficial frostbite or deep frostbite. Superficial frostbite only involves the top layers of the skin and fatty tissue. The body part will become pale, hard, cold, and waxy. So it'll look kind of white or yellowish instead of pink, or normal colored, and it will feel kind of different. The skin will feel a little bit different. When rewarming the area, it will feel numb, and then it will start to sting and burn. Superficial frostbite can blister and be painful for several weeks. This can occur, if you're out walking in a cold environment and you accidentally step in a puddle and then your toes get really cold and get frostbite. It can be that simple. So deep frostbite indicates frozen skin requiring hospitalization. So this photograph here is of somebody who got deep frostbite. If somebody has deep frostbite, we want to do rapid rewarming. So the water that we're rewarming in should be about 100 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is about where most people will keep a hot tub. So it should feel about hot tub temperature. The tissue will become blotchy and red, swollen, painful, and if the person has been outside for too long and the skin has been frostbitten for too long, it can become gangrenous, like in this picture, where the fingers became blackened and the tissue died, and the person lost the tip of one of their fingers. The others may not survive either. Another environmental phenomena that is not super common in San Diego County, but we can see, is lightning. In other parts of the country, this is actually a big problem. It tends to cause a lot of issues. When I lived in Michigan, my second year, I worked at a high school, and we had thunderstorms every single day during football practice. So we basically had to stop practice every single day because of lightning, because lightning is dangerous enough to make it so that we have to stop practice or events if it's happening. Lightning is the number 2 cause of death by weather phenomena. Each year, there are about 110 deaths from people being outside in lightning. Oftentimes, it could be, if people were out hiking and they didn't expect a thunderstorm or weather changed and they got caught in bad weather and they were struck by lightning. That's a possibility. In places like Michigan, big time golfers will still go out and try to keep golfing even in thunderstorms, and the golf club basically becomes a lightning rod and somebody gets hit by lightning. Thunder always accompanies lightning, so we do get a little bit of a warning at least. There'll be a thunderclap and then a lightning strike. During a thunderstorm, we want to seek shelter in a building or in a car, something enclosed that is not made of metal. We definitely do not want to stand near a large tree or a tall metal object, including metal bleachers. Metal bleachers are not safe to stand under during a lightning storm. Both large trees and tall metal objects like bleachers will become a lightning rod if lightning strikes anywhere nearby. One thing to be aware of is if you are stuck in a lightning storm and you can't seek shelter, if your hair stands on end on your hands or arms, you're about to get hit by lightning. So you can't outrun it or anything like that. So the best thing to do is to get as low as you can, crouch on the balls of your feet and curl up and put your hands over your ears so that your eardrums don't burst. Lightning will go through whatever parts of your body are upright, basically, from the ground. So lightning actually comes up from the ground. So in this crouched position, like in the photograph, the person will basically have lightning go through the balls of his feet, his thighs, his middle torso, up his back. So just in that small line, versus if he was standing upright, it would go all the way through his whole body. And when lightning goes through your body, it's like an electrical burn. So the person will get electrical burns throughout the area that the lightning is striking. So basically, we're just trying to do our best to minimize the damage that's about to occur by crouching low. So on this slide, we're going to talk about when to seek shelter during a thunderstorm. Just because we see lightning and hear thunder doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go inside immediately. And again, our safe areas are inside a building or inside a closed car with the windows up. We want to try to avoid touching any metal that we can in the car. Even though the car is made of metal, the tires are rubber, so that helps to defray or diminish any of the electricity that is sent through the car, but we still don't want to touch any parts of metal that we can avoid. So we want to use the flash to bang method to try to estimate the distance that a storm is away if we're trying to decide whether or not to cancel a practice or an event or to delay it. So basically what happens is we'll hear we'll see the lightning strike, and then we'll hear the thunder. So once we hear we see the lightning strike, we're going to count 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, however long it takes to count that. And then we're going to divide that number by 5 to calculate how many miles away it is. So if we counted to 5, it would be 1 mile away. At a count of 15 seconds, or 3 miles away, everyone in that area should seek shelter. Now, we need to wait at least 30 minutes to go back outside after the last lightning strike. So it's unfortunately common during a lightning or thunderstorm to have lightning happen, or lightning will strike and we'll have to go inside, and then we'll be just getting ready to go back outside. It'll have been 25 minutes since the last lightning strike, and then it'll happen again. So it's a little bit unfortunate. Sometimes when we were in Michigan, we actually canceled, I want to say it was 1 or 2 soccer games due to lightning, and it was kind of, I think that we waited about an hour before we ended up actually having to cancel the game, and hanging out under metal bleachers because nobody figured out that wasn't safe, and we didn't really have anywhere else to go because nobody had keys to the only building that was nearby. It was very unsafe. So, but basically, you have to wait it out. Lightning can strike with blue skies. We actually did have a football practice for a camp canceled once because lightning, even though it was beautiful, totally blue skies above our part of the field, on the other side of campus, there was a lightning strike that was close enough to warrant it. So it was very interesting. We are going to calculate this flash to bang as a part of our quiz after the chapter. So just be aware of that as well.